Hey guys, so here's part 3 of the 3.4 day 1 notes. Now we're going to once again find the inverse of a function, but now we're going to see what happens when we have a restriction as part of it. Okay, so we have f of x equals negative 5x squared, and x is greater than or equal to 0. Okay, let's first just talk about, because notice this is a quadratic. So no, when we have a quadratic, of course it looks like this, right? Okay. Now, we wanted to reflect this over the line y equals x, okay? If we wanted to do the inverse, it would look like this, okay? So here we have, then our inverse here would be y equals plus minus square root of x. Now notice, let's talk about being a function. We know that, of course, a quadratic is a function. But if we have both parts of our quadratic, right, would this be a function? Well, not necessarily. Now the plus square root of x represents the top half, and the minus square root of x represents the negative. Now, when we have a domain restriction, that means we are only actually taking part of our quadratic and reflecting it. So let's talk about what does that look like. Okay, so we have negative 5x squared. So we're going to graph or sketch that graph, should I say. So I'm going to change this. Okay, so negative 5x squared, we know that's probably going to be skinny, and it's going to face down because remember, a value is negative. Okay, so let's say this is y equals negative 5x squared. But if we only want where x is greater than or equal to 0, we actually only want part of our quadratic. Now, when it says x is greater than or equal to 0, that means the x values, remember, that is going to be our horizontal. The x values are positive. So we only want to talk about anything that's around the positive x values. So the other part of this quadratic, I'm going to go ahead and erase because that's not part of our problem. There we go. So that's what we are going to try to reflect. So remember, we are reflecting over the line, right, y equals x. Right? So let's go ahead, let's do the, find the inverse and then talk about, well, what would be our final answer, okay? So we have, remember the first step is to switch our x and y. I'm going to put this below. Actually, I'll just put it over here. Okay, so we switch our x and y. Write the instructions so we remember. Okay, so now I have x is equal to negative 5y squared. Now I solve for y. Okay, so I get, let's see. So first thing, I need to divide both sides by negative 5. That's my first thing. So I get negative x over 5 squared. Then I take the square root of both sides. Okay. Now, when we did this before, right, we did an example where we had x squared. We had the plus minus sign. But now remember, because we have a restriction starting with our problem, that means we're not doing the inverse of the entire quadratic, only part of it. So we need to determine, okay, which part works, okay? So this is our function. Let's say what happens when we have the inverse. So I'm going to draw that. Okay. So we are reflecting over that line. Basically what happens is that we're going to have the graph going like this, okay, because this is reflecting over that y equals x. Now let's look here, right? Notice what is happening, okay? Our x are now negative and the y's are going positive. So if we are wanting this, instead of doing plus minus, are we wanting positive numbers or do we want negative numbers when we plug here? Well, we basically want positive, right? So we want the positive amount here. So we are going to have the square root of negative x over 5. Right? And the reason we want positive is, remember that we switched. So when we had the original, the x was greater. When we do the inverse, we switch that to the y. So the y has to be greater than or equal to 0. Okay, because remember, we switched our x and y. So the idea of, and we'll talk about this later, domain and range, they switch. So we have to have positive square root of negative x over 5. Okay, and then don't forget our last step is to change that y into the notation, inverse notation. So we're going to have f inverse of x equals just the square root of negative x over 5. So remember, we don't do plus minus, so the last problem we did that. Here we don't, because we only want part of the inverse, okay, because we only had part of the quadratic. And we decided to do the positive instead of doing the plus minus, we decided to do the positive instead of the negative, because when we look at the restriction on our original problem, the x was greater than or equal to 0. When we switch it to the inverse, instead of still saying about x, we now talk about y, because the x and y change. So since x was greater than or equal to 0, our y has to be greater than or equal to 0. And in order to be greater than, that means it needs to be positive. Okay? Okay, make sure you work on the homework assignment, and if you have any questions, make sure you contact me. See you guys later.